What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review Supergirl. And as you can tell from my totally natural organic muscles, I got nice and swollen ahead of time just to tackle this movie in the proper spirit. And even if I don't have much of a favorable report to offer for this movie, as I always like to do with any comic book property, I'm going to make a few recommendations featuring the character of Supergirl. So if you went looking for a good Supergirl story and didn't find one, perhaps some of my other recommendations, like the story featured in this bad boy, which hangs proudly on my wall in my apartment, perhaps some of those recommendations will scratch the itch if this movie failed to do so. But let's start with this movie, which is mostly a bland, joyless experience with the occasional bright spot. Like, my crowd went absolutely berserk when Superman showed up, and I will admit, I was kind of caught off guard by just how excited I was to see the character, and I will look forward to seeing him in his next movie. But this Supergirl movie in particular has a couple of crippling weaknesses. First and foremost, the fastest way to ruin a movie is put an annoying kid in it. Check. Another way to ruin a movie is the absence of an interesting villain. Check. And another way to ruin a movie is to give it a couple of really unexciting, unremarkable action sequences, most of which we've already seen due to all the trailers and clips that are floating around out there. So once again, check. My conclusion, this movie is dead on arrival, but perhaps Milly Alcock can have a bit of a redemption arc in the future with a cameo in the next Superman movie. But the existential question is, just how bad is it? Because I know everybody's really excited right now because they can smell blood in the water, everybody's sharpening their knives, and they're preparing to stick it in the movie's ribs and give it a nice twist. But is it Madam Web bad? Is it The Marvels bad? Is it Birds of Prey bad? I don't think so, but it's barely better. I guess what makes it slightly better than those other mediocrities? I mean, Lobo's okay. And Superman is charming. I mean, both Lobo and Superman are barely in the movie, but at least they're there. They're fun to watch when they're on the screen. But the big question now is, who deserves the blame for this failure of a movie? Because anytime a movie's popular or successful, there are a lot of people raising their hands, claiming to be the movie's parent. Like, there's an old cliche, I can't remember the exact phrasing of it, but a success has many parents, but a failure rapidly becomes an orphan. And I don't know how many people are going to be raising their hands claiming credit for this movie. Obviously, it's part of like the James Gunn verse. I know it's called the DC Universe, but really at this point, every show or movie that's been released so far, part of this new DC Universe, has a little bit of James Gunn's fingerprints. But technically, it was written by Anna Nogueira, who's a first-time screenwriter who has a lot of experience as an actress, but very little experience as a writer. Her only previous writing credit was a 2018 short film called We Win. And yet, somehow she got the gig writing Supergirl, as well as the upcoming Teen Titans, as well as the upcoming Wonder Woman movie. I have a feeling whoever the powers that be are over at DC and Warner Brothers, and obviously Warner Brothers is being absorbed into Paramount, they should perhaps revisit that conversation, because if this is going to be the calling card for Anna Nogueira's talents as a writer moving forward, I think anything she writes is automatically doomed to failure. Because any writer who's given a roadmap of a completed story like Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow by Tom King and then turns it into what this movie became, well then they've got some problems. Because they basically took a few ingredients from the first issue and like one or two ingredients from later in the story and threw out the rest. But they shouldn't be mentioning Tom King's story at all. And speaking of which, I'm not the world's biggest fan of Tom King as a comic book writer. However, the artwork in this comic, it's beautifully illustrated. So if you just want to get some good eye candy featuring the character of Supergirl, this comic will deliver. But here's the synopsis of the story as written over on IMDb. Kara Zor-El, aka Supergirl, joins forces with an unlikely companion on an interstellar journey of vengeance and justice when an unexpected adversary strikes too close to home. And that's fine, that more or less gets the job done. But there's a conspiracy theory floating around that James Gunn actually wrote this screenplay, but he was worried about the perception of basically having too much control over all the films in the DC universe and having too much like authorship. And so they brought in Anna Nogueira to be like kind of the face of the company. Who the hell knows what's true and what's not? I imagine that James Gunn had quite a lot of input because there's so much in this movie that feels reminiscent of a lot of James Gunn's earlier work. But if this movie ends up being a giant bomb, I doubt James Gunn's ever going to take credit for writing this movie. But the other major creator involved in this movie is director Craig Gillespie, who's probably most famous for directing I, Tonya, as well as Cruella. And Cruella was a big, massive success. So I've no trouble understanding why he was hired to direct this movie, but he was probably miscast as a director because he's doing everything in his power to create a movie that is reminiscent of the James Gunn style, but he's not James Gunn. He's Craig Gillespie, and he probably should have stuck with movies that are a little bit more grounded in reality, movies like I, Tonya. And it's, of course, inevitable that people are going to keep bringing up comparisons to Guardians of the Galaxy because it's borrowing so heavily from Guardians of the Galaxy. Even the look of Supergirl throughout most of the movie, walking around in a trench coat and getting in bar fights and listening to pop music, that's basically Peter Quill from Guardians. But the pop music in Guardians makes sense because Peter Quill in that movie, if you'll remember, he has a mixtape that his mother gave to him on her deathbed. And so throughout the entire movie, he's thinking about his mom playing all these pop songs that she loved. So it makes sense that you're hearing it everywhere he goes. In this movie, it makes no sense whatsoever because on multiple planets that are not called Earth, deep into space, for whatever reason, on the jukebox in those bars, they're playing music from Earth without any explanation as to why. Or the worst example, at one point, Kara goes to some bar where there's a band performing The Girl from Ipanema. And I'm sorry, there's not a lot of bossa nova out in space, or if there is, cool, but you got to explain how are they performing that famous album by Stan Getz and Gilberto that came out like 60 years ago, way out in the deep fringes of space. It just makes no fucking sense. It's one of many reasons why this movie feels like a piss-poor kind of copycat in many respects of other movies that are much more popular. And the most annoying part of the kind of like the rollout of this movie and all the influencers that are invited to the early screenings is how they were all given the exact same talking points with which to describe the movie. Every single person kept saying, "Oh, I like how she's messy. Oh, and I like how it's kind of like Mad Max." It's like, well, how come every single person who went to the same screening is describing the movie in the exact same ways? Like, at least give people some different talking points so they don't sound like robotic automatons just repeating the crap that like the people from marketing and publicity have told them to say. And I'm sorry, the parts of this movie where Supergirl is supposedly messy are the least interesting parts of this movie, because a good drunk on screen is someone like Richard E. Grant in Withnail and I. And famously, Richard E. Grant was not allowed to drink. He couldn't drink because he was allergic to alcohol, but he played probably the best drunk we've ever seen on screen, because a real drunk who's shit-faced all the time is always trying to pretend to be sober, but they're barely holding it together. That's what makes a drunk really compelling on screen. And if you go to any bar or any saloon on planet Earth, usually people who are degenerate drunks are always trying to pretend like they're totally fine, even though they obviously are not. The way that Milly Alcock plays it in this movie is the exact opposite, where she's like, acting like just kind of a ditzy, stupid drunk, but it comes across like a stereotype or an actor who's never gotten drunk before. And I know she's gotten drunk before because she freely admits in all of her interviews that she likes her martinis and she likes her cigarettes. She should know better as an actress, or who knows, maybe she got some very poor direction from Craig Gillespie. But getting back to Craig Gillespie as a director, in the end, he probably was a poor choice as a director for this movie because he knows nothing about staging action scenes. The action scenes in this movie are completely, totally devoid of any thrills or any excitement. Milly Alcock, clearly, no one even bothered to teach her how to throw a punch. They're just relying upon kind of like really rubbery, spongy special effects to create the illusion that she knows how to throw a punch when they go flying off. But it's much more compelling and much more exciting if the person throwing a punch looks badass as they're doing it, and then you let them go flying off into the sunset, etc., and so forth. But also, Craig Gillespie clearly doesn't have like a vision for this universe that he's creating. This is the first movie of the DC universe set in space. It's a golden opportunity to populate this universe with interesting races and interesting planets and interesting characters. He did none of that. I mean, you get a far better journey in this comic, but this was a chance to tease characters like Brainiac or Mongol, or if they were taking requests like a DJ, I would have told them to leave this idiotic villain Krem totally out of the movie, because he's a boring villain, he's a bland villain. Like, people are gonna struggle to remember his name the moment they walk out of the theater. Or even better would have been to throw out the revenge story altogether, because the little girl in this movie is so fucking annoying. There's like a 20-minute sequence where Supergirl is out of commission due to being poisoned by a green sun. And so this little girl basically has to take center stage and take over all the heroic actions of the movie. It is just like when fucking Grogu goes on his side quest in The Mandalorian Grogu, because the Mandalorian is poisoned. It almost feels like all these lame, shitty movies are like going to a conference every year and like taking notes from each other's like terrible ideas for stories. Anyway, I would have recommended they throw out the entire story and instead cook up a story that takes the best episodes and the best scenes of Supergirl's character from the show Justice League Unlimited. For people who have not seen that show, it's readily available on HBO Max. It's 3 seasons. I think it's some of the best animation I've ever seen that's tackling the world of DC Comics. But if you watch those 3 seasons, there are probably 6 or 7 episodes featuring Supergirl scattered throughout. But if you just watch those episodes, and I did ahead of watching this movie, you basically get a pretty cool story arc and a pretty cool character arc, where at first she's just trying to get onto the Justice League and she's kind of living in Superman's shadow, and then she learns about this conspiracy to clone her, creating this other really powerful evil character. And then the story ends with her finally going into the future and joining the Legion of Superheroes, which is very comic book accurate. Back in the 1960s, Supergirl used to go on adventures with the Legion of Superheroes all the time and had a little love affair with, I think, Brainiac 5, who's a nice Brainiac, not the evil Brainiac. So as promised, that's at least my first recommendation I'm going to make in this video. Watch the Supergirl episodes from Justice League Unlimited, and you will get a much more satisfying Supergirl story than you get from this movie. But big picture, I think in hindsight, people are going to regard this movie as a wild miscalculation or just a big giant creative misfire when it comes to being the second movie in the DC universe, because this year Sony's giving us Spider-Man Brand New Day, which looks like it's going to be just an absolute box office smash, and Disney is giving us Avengers Doomsday. And I don't know how good those movies will be, but they're at least, they feel like events. They feel like movies that people are screaming to see. Nobody's screaming to see a Supergirl movie. Like the audience for Supergirl has always been niche at best. Like every once in a while, she'll get a cool storyline. Like in the early 2000s, Jeff Loeb was writing the comic book Superman Batman, and they gave us a great arc where they reintroduced the character of Supergirl, and then she gets basically kidnapped and brainwashed by Darkseid. And they ended up turning that into an animated movie. But that was a cool Supergirl story. But once again, it's niche. It's for like the true comic book nerds. I basically would recommend that DC go with any other team or any other character, like do Young Justice or do the Teen Titans or fuck it, do the Legion of Superheroes in the 31st century and have Kara Zor-El come forward to go on an adventure with them. That would have been a killer movie. But it needed a lot more wow factor. It needed some bigger stars. It needed some bigger, like iconic superhero and or supervillain characters to flesh out this universe. Like even the depiction of Krypton is totally lifeless, totally boring. How do you turn something as cool as the destruction of Krypton and a piece of it floating off into space? How do you make that boring? But this movie, somehow, it finds a way. And speaking of the depiction of Krypton, James Gunn's DC universe is still clinging to the idiotic notion that Jor-El sent Superman to Earth in order to conquer it and repopulate it. It doesn't even make sense in the way they depict it. It's completely, totally inconsistent because in this movie, Kara Zor-El's parents are like, oh, well, we're going to send you to Earth where my crazy brother sent his son to conquer the place. Like, well, why would you send her there? As seen in this movie, there are a million planets that have a yellow sun where she'll be able to thrive and grow and do just fine. Why send her to the place where like the son of your evil brother is going to be trying to take it over like a totalitarian emperor? But also, if you'll recall, in the Superman movie last year, Superman's constantly watching this message from his parents, but it's garbled and it's kind of corrupted and he can't quite hear what they're saying. And also, he doesn't speak Kryptonian, but at the end of the movie, he finally learns like the true agenda of his parents. But my question is, in all the years that Kara Zor-El is on Earth, in the context of this movie, she speaks Kryptonian. Why, in all of her visits to the Fortress of Solitude, couldn't she have at least had the goddamn courtesy to translate the message for Clark? Because Clark is obviously listening to that message 24/7 because he finds it so soothing. You would think she would say, oh, by the way, your father was fucking crazy and he sent you here to repopulate the planet. So it's like, the way they're rolling out this universe and the way they're building this universe, it's like they're not thinking more than like one step ahead. Like, oh, it'd be cool and edgy if Jor-El is like really evil. But if you're going to do that stupid bullshit, well, then you have to have the courage of your convictions and think it through. Also, if Jor-El had this big master plan of sending his baby to Earth to conquer the Earth and repopulate it, knowing about the power of the yellow sun, if Jor-El had that kind of mad ambition, why wouldn't he have like basically packed up the wife and kid into a spaceship? Why wouldn't they all go to Earth, long before the destruction of Krypton? Then they can all be all powerful and bring a few like psychotic friends along, and bring General Zod and bring all the lunatics along. Once again, they're not thinking these things through. They think they sound cool and edgy in the moment, but it's piss poor storytelling. But what is not piss poor storytelling, as I mentioned before, this hangs proudly in my apartment here in New York, and I'm a big fan of it. I mean, it's obviously an iconic cover that most people are familiar with, even if they haven't read the issue. And it's a pose that's been used many times before, like, whoa. Scott Summers holding Phoenix on the cover of one of Uncanny X-Men back in the day. Basically, it's a pose that gets used over and over and over again. But if you really want to nerd out about the DC universe, read Crisis on Infinite Earths. And I was about 9 or 10 when this story was unfolding, and it was so big and so complicated, I could barely follow it at the time. But what I love about this trade paperback, it's the wraparound cover where George Perez did the layouts, and then Alex Ross painted over it. It might be my favorite piece of comic book art ever created, where everything you need to know about the DC universe is contained in that wraparound art. It's absolutely gorgeous. But the issue where Supergirl really gets to shine is issue number 7, where she goes up against insurmountable odds and basically sacrifices herself on behalf of her friends. And what's cool is it's super 80s. She's wearing a fucking headband in the fight. Nothing screams 80s more than a Supergirl's wearing a fucking headband, but she's totally balls to the wall, totally badass, and just as heroic and noble and idealistic as Superman could ever be, even on his best day. It's awesome. It's the kind of stuff that makes comic book nerds turn into comic book nerds in the first place. And what made it even more bittersweet was shortly thereafter, Alan Moore was asked to basically wrap up all the traditional continuity of Superman, and he did so with 2 issues. But at one point in these 2 issues, which basically like explore all the best characters from like the late 50s up through like the mid 80s, but the Legion of Superheroes and Supergirl come back in time to pay him a visit. But at that time, Supergirl doesn't know that her adult form in the mid 80s has recently been killed, and she's like, well, where am I? Like, have I gotten old and pretty and blah blah blah? And she's asking all these questions, and Superman's just beside himself with grief, trying to conceal the fact that in their present day she has sacrificed herself for all of her friends. So for me, that was the peak of Supergirl as a character, and also it just helps that I was at a very young, impressionable age when I was getting exposed to these stories. But in the aftermath of the Crisis on Infinite Earths, a lot of characters got rebooted, a lot of teams got reformed, which led to perhaps my all-time favorite comic in the history of the DC Universe, Justice League International. And I've got a bunch of the Justice League International stories, whoa, in these cool kind of hardback bound editions. But by the time we got to issue 18, or actually no, I think it was 17 and 18, or 18 and 19, that was when I first encountered the character of Lobo. And obviously Lobo is a big part of this movie, or at least he's part of the feature attraction. He's trying to get basically, some guys out there to believe there might be a trace of masculinity in this movie. And Jason Momoa, he does his best, but he's basically just doing the Jason Momoa routine. But what I loved about my introduction to Lobo was like your classic gimmick, where on the cover of one issue, you had Lobo intimidating Guy Gardner, who at that time, his brain had kind of gotten rewired and he'd gotten really friendly and really kind of soft and affable. But in the following issue, his personality had been restored, and he says, I'm back. But anyway, if you want to sell comics off a spinner rack at 7-Eleven or off the shelf of a comic book store, a good gimmick will take you a long way. And so that would be my recommendation for where to start with Lobo, who was huge in the 90s. I mean, if you were into like Punisher or like Deadpool or Cable or Wolverine or any of the kind of like the really violent kind of countercultural characters, Lobo was kind of all those characters wrapped into one. So what does the future hold for James Gunn and his DC universe? I think the box office on this movie is going to be soft on its opening weekend, and then it's just going to drop off a cliff. It's going to be a big, embarrassing failure, I think, in the long run. I might be wrong. Maybe there's legions of Supergirl fans that are just screaming for this interpretation of the character, but I doubt it. But obviously, he's got his next Superman movie already underway, where Superman and Lex Luthor team up to take on Brainiac. If he delivers, if he understands the assignment and realizes, wow, like, pressure's on, I got to really deliver, it could be one of the coolest fucking superhero movies ever made. It could be astonishing. If you take the man who gave us the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy, as well as like, Slither and Super and The Suicide Squad, that's a talented filmmaker. In recent years, I don't know if he's gotten too complacent, or maybe after he got married, he got distracted, or for whatever reason. But I think that season 1 and 2 of Peacemaker they were humiliating. I thought the interpretation of Peacemaker in The Suicide Squad was far more interesting. And then the Superman movie, it had its moments, but it had its moments where it didn't have its moments. And I thought it could have been much more, especially after I saw that first trailer, where I thought it was just going to be like the greatest superhero movie ever made. So he can still deliver. And obviously we have Clayface this fall. And for me, making a Clayface movie that doesn't feature Batman makes about as much sense as making like a Morbius movie without Spider-Man. But the trailer does look pretty freaky. Like maybe if they can introduce the character and it's super hardcore and terrifying and it kind of appeals to the Halloween audience, then maybe they can tee up an inevitable confrontation between that Clayface and Batman. But for me, it's like superheroes and supervillains are like yin and yang, and they kind of bring out their best qualities. And Clayface needs Batman, and Batman needs Clayface, and so on and so forth. And like same way like Superman needs Brainiac and Lex Luthor and Bizarro and all those characters. Like these characters Sony has already proven a bunch of standalone supervillain movies don't really work, even if one or two of them made some decent box office in the case of Venom. But we shall see what we shall see when it comes to DC. But I suspect, best case scenario, obviously Clayface will come out and Superman Man of Tomorrow will come out. But now that Warner Brothers is being absorbed by yet another studio, I have a feeling they're going to say, all right, show us what you got, or we're bringing this little experiment to an end. But who knows? Maybe in 2 or 3 years' time, maybe Matt Reeves will be the architect in charge of the DC universe. We'll just have to wait and see. But I think for now I've said enough. So let me know what you think down in the comments below. Remember to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and stay tuned tomorrow for a 50th anniversary review for The Omen, a video that I worked really hard on. I'm very proud of. But hope everybody has a great weekend. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.